Let's deal with this. All right, everybody's on stage. Excellent. Hello and welcome to our religion panel. If you are here watching in the audience, here's the technical spiel. I do not work for Zoom, but if you are having any trouble with this session or accessing anything, please let me know. I'll do my best to get you all set up. Our panelists are here. We can hear them. We can see them. Things are going well. So I'm going to introduce Trevor, Aurora, Bailey, and Greg and let them take us away to talk about religion. So please
Yeah,
enjoy.
welcome to the religion panel. We're going to determine which one of them is true. I'm just kidding.
We'll have a definitive answer at the end of this episode.
No one's ever tried a 5-person panel to determine the truth before. Actually, except they sort of have, and we're going to get into that. Today we're going to be covering sort of two specific sort of instances in religious history that we feel like relate to deception, be it more accurately, times when somebody decided that they were going to determine what the narrative of that religion is. In which case, often cutting out parts of the religion they didn't agree with and no longer found acceptable. And so in that way, sort of deceiving the general world and the history going forward about what that entailed. What does that religion mean? What is true for it? And we're talking about a couple instances in which this was sort of coalesced to a choke point where these sorts of things are determined. So we're going to talk about everyone's favorite emperor, Constantine. Yeah, boo for Constantine and sort of the council. Yeah, and the Council of Nicaea.
They
and
did
then
all
we are
right.
going to, and then we are going to talk about, fast forwarding into the future, sort of Western contact with Zoroastrianism and the way the sort of Christian worldview uh, sort of changed Zoroastrianism in the way it was interpreted by sort of funneling it through a Christian worldview. But so we are going to go ahead and start by talking with one of my two least favorite emperors. We're going to talk about Constantine. Take it
Constantine
away,
the
Greg.
Great. Put some respect on that name. So, hello,
Ugh.
everyone. Believe it or not, there is, like we said, a lot of deception tied up in religious history. So, for time, I'm just going to kind of dive in. Traditional accounts of the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine often go something like this. On October 27th, 312 AD, the night before a critical battle at the Milvian Bridge, Constantine the Great saw a cross in the sky and decided to fight for Jesus, I guess, and won, and so the Roman Empire was Christian now, alleluia and amen. And now let's talk about 1492 so we can get to 1776. Okay, so that particular version is the American edition, but you can sub in your particular nationality's edition for any Christian nationalist story. So the fact that Constantine is tied up with Christian nationalism is no mistake. Bringing nationalism to Christianity was Constantine's great project. Jesus of Nazareth, aka the Christ part of Christianity, that man, that God man, did not have nationalism in mind when he said things like, "My kingdom is not of this world." But Constantine's kingdom was definitely of this world, and his first order of business was unity. Not surprising, since his secular impact was also unity. After all, the battle I referenced earlier was part of his project of undoing Diocletian's work and becoming sole emperor.
Ooh.
When it came to the church, that unity came most apparently in his active promotion of church councils to settle matters of theology. Starting with a council at Arles just a year after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and culminating in the famous and great Council of Nicaea in 325, over which Constantine personally presided. He used the church's institutions to promote church unity. Sounds like a good thing, right? And to be clear, the church was fine with that. They too wanted everyone to have the same theology. Even the people being cast out, wanted the church to be unified. They just wanted it to be under their theology. So it's not like people were complaining about the church being showered in state support, unless the state happened to support the other people in the church. So yet, the mutual embrace of Constantine and the church was a seismic shift in the church, drawing it from an otherworldly institution where the flesh was looked upon with a suspicion to a worldly institution where the flesh was looked upon with maybe slightly less suspicion, but not really. Anyways, back in the day, the straight up anti-world and anti-matter, not the physics concept, but you know what I mean, a heresy of Gnosticism had flourished. After Constantine, things swung far enough to invent the previously mentioned concept of Christian nationalism. By the end of the century, the state was executing heretics, though notably this was initially to the church's horror, and the Pope excommunicated those involved. Which brings me to another point. While it certainly had social implications, excommunication, the church's harshest penalty, was primarily a spiritual penalty. They weren't doing fines, they weren't doing imprisonment. They would, just kind of socially cast you off. The real idea was the punishment was hell. The church did not especially concern itself with such temporal matters until Constantine. Certainly, as I mentioned, Jesus was ultimately concerned about the spiritual world and the next life, which didn't and doesn't mean not caring for justice on earth, but I'm summarizing. Those interested should check out St. Augustine's ridiculously influential work, City of God, which is too topical for me to not mention even in this brief summary, but I'm going to skip ahead to Pope Gelasius and his two swords theory, the two swords being the temporal, that is the secular, and the spiritual. Brie and I have a disagreement on Augustine, specifically his name. Constantine's conversion is the reason Gelasius gave the secular sword any real consideration, even though Gelasius put the spiritual sword firmly at the head, which makes sense given that the papacy only had the spiritual sword at that time. A few centuries later, they would hold both temporal and spiritual swords, and a few centuries beyond that, the papacy would be using both of those swords to wage the very worldly wars known as the Crusades in the name of God. Spoilers for Pontifex listeners.
Amen.
For this merger of the sacred and the secular, we can primarily thank Constantine's conversion of the church to the world, which has been effectively, though deceptively, billed as a conversion of the world to the church. So that's my rant.
So as we can see, it's everything that happened through European history and world history is Constantine's fault.
Yeah. It's pretty easy to squarely put the blame. If you had to do one man, it would be Constantine, I think.
Not to do great man theory, but
it's not great man theory. It's the opposite. Anti-great man theory.
Terrible man theory.
Terrible man theory.
So this idea that Constantine sort of bringing the church to the world sort of has convinced the world in retrospect that the church was sort of meant to be a temporal power. If you ask Christian nationalists now, there's solid belief that church power should be temporal, that it should be physically punishing people, not spiritually punishing them. And that is, as you said, sort of a deceptive reading of what you could argue was the intention when at its foundation.
Oh, yeah, it would be unrecognizable from what Jesus's real ideals were, even 300 years after it was created, let alone 2000, right?
And I think it has knock-on effects, things like slavery, for example. It would have been a lot harder for Christianity to wind up kind of stomaching slavery if it hadn't been a Roman institution that they were somewhat inheriting by taking on Roman culture, more intentionally after Constantine. Not that there weren't influences even before Christianity was Christianity. You can see that cultural exchange overall, but
it's not our idea. It's the idea of the past Christians. So that makes it right.
Yeah.
If it was good enough for Constantine, it's good enough for me, I guess.
Yep.
It's the appeal from antiquity in the last panel.
It really is. Bailey or Trevor, do either of you have anything else you wanted to touch on with Constantine and this sort of the instatification of the Christian
obvious
faith?
Greatness of the man?
Yeah, you could really see it leading off to even how we look at things nowadays in terms of America. They kind of have that same view of themselves as other nations in the past, usually Christian nations, admittedly in our Western world have. So Britain, Rome, now America, see justifications for terrible things in the pretext of our religion is a war for it, you know.
People
And
would
now,
be confused if, you told them like Jesus would be kind of really thrown off if you said like, oh, we're a Christian nation. Like, what is that?
Yeah.
what number one? What's a nation?
Christian, yeah, okay. Two questions.
um, obviously, I want to throw in the caveat there that you can easily also find other religious traditions that never even pretended to have that sort of separation of spiritual and temporal power,
Mhm.
because they had sort of the elevation of the spiritual authority as a temporal authority sort of baked into them. So, before somebody thinks that we're just being like, oh, only Christians are terrible, like, we don't want to need to go into like sort of ancient Shinto or some other religions that sort of had that sort of moral temporal authority built into them as well. It's just a very clear case in Christian history for us where we can find it's this guy, this dude did it.
And it's also hard to when you're in it, it's hard to see what other people are saying, right? Especially if you're just a random person who goes to church every Sunday, and then you start hearing people talk about how this one man ruined everything, and you're like, what? Like, I don't know what you mean. Like, my life's not affected.
Well, and it's not like he had a lot of opposition, like I said, from within the church.
Oh,
No.
yeah.
It's not like there were bishops taking a principled stand against, getting more worldly. Like there were a whole lot of incentives for them to do that. Like you had, their eyes being gouged out and then being put to death before this. Like, yeah, I would be tempted to take that deal. But also, like, I mean, we talk about, looking at the Bible, the temptation in the desert, specifically, one of the things that this Christian tradition says that Satan tempted Jesus with was, hey, look, you get power over the nations of the earth. And he's like, yeah, that's not what I'm here for, though.
Yeah.
And I
Could say
think
Jesus had been reading his Cincinnatus, I guess.
He's been reading his George Washington. He knows.
That's right. He knows.
And I think that's actually a decent transition point, because we're going to shift to a religion that has gone through the started without a state power, became a state power, and fell out of state power cycle.
Yeah, let's get our Zoroastrian.
All right.
Zoroastrian, and again, I think it's a good follow-on here, because what happens, we're going to be discussing, is how Christianity interpreted Zoroastrianism and how that affected the faith as a whole.
Yeah. And some people might not know what Zoroastrianism is, because it's not really as big as it used to be back in its heyday. So I'm just going to explain a bit about what Zoroastrianism is, and how then we can go on to talk about how it's changed today. Now, Zoroastrianism is allegedly the oldest monotheistic religion, as my Twitter comments will constantly remind me whenever, because I accidentally said it was definitively the monotheistic religion, the first one. And it was founded sometime during the second millennium BC. It's very vague on detail very early on. The Indo-Iranian religion in Zarathustra's time was polytheistic. And Zarathustra, otherwise known as Zoroaster by the Greeks, he really pushed it to the forefront to have one deity in charge of everything. Very little is known about Zoroaster outside of Zoroastrian scriptures, but he is thought to have been born in 628 BC in Iran and may have died around 551 BC. Although there is a battle going on between historians, because some also believe that he was born anywhere between 1000 and 2000 BCE. So I'm glad we got our date on there.
I'm glad we got that settled.
Yeah, I'm glad it's all fixed. Now, Zoroaster is credited for founding the first monotheistic religion in the world, in his region, as he was the key figure to turn Zoroastrianism monotheistic. Now, Zoroaster likely elevated a pre-existing deity to the role of supreme creator, thus monotheism is born, allegedly. This supreme creator is Ahura Mazda. Now, he is the only god worshipped in Zoroastrianism, and Ahura Mazda is the creator deity, or the sun god, or the god of the sky. There's plenty of names for him. His name translates to Lord Wisdom, which, fair enough, that's amazing. Although the existence of lesser spiritual beings is also recognized in the religion as well. Now, Zoroastrian promotes choosing good over evil and emphasizes actions over beliefs. Central to the Zoroastrian belief system, it is the idea that Ahura Mazda is the supreme being of goodness and light, and is opposed by Angara Maininu. It's a dead language. It's fine. I've only seen it written down.
Trevor's bringing it back.
Now, this man, Angara, is not equal in power at all, but he's the spirit of darkness and evil. He's the equivalent of Satan and the devil in more of our like monotheistic Christian and Muslim and Jewish religions. Now, all traditional Zoroastrian temples, also known as places of fire, include a holy fire to represent the goodness and purity towards which all should strive for. Once it is properly consecrated, a fire temple should never be allowed to go out, although it can be transported to another location if necessary, which is difficult probably to keep that fire going on the road. Although it should be said that fire was not worshipped, a lot is kind of a misconception. Even me a year ago thought that Zoroastrians were fire worshippers. But it's very much in the same way that holy water is for Christians. It's not a holy thing. It's more so the spiritual qualities are recognized, but it's not God. The water isn't God in the same way the fire isn't Ahura Mazda. Now, Zoroastrian,
the wine might be God.
What?
The wine is God, just to be clear.
After a few glasses, it definitely is. Zoroastrianism expanded to become one of the most important religions in the ancient world from 600 BC to 650 CE until the Muslim Caliphate conquest pushed it away from the world front. Now, there is a book called the Avesta, which is not the same as the Bible, but I guess to other people, it would be the version of the Bible. Now, it's a sacred text containing how Zoroastrians feel about the law, the universe, and the teachings of the prophet Zarathustra. It's also a large part Zoroastrianism. It inspires a lot from what modern religions do. For example, heaven and hell started with Zoroastrianism. Satan and a official like Judgment Day. These are all things that were kind of taken from Zoroastrianism and put into different religions, or allegedly. Lastly, it's important to note that because Zoroastrianism is so ancient and the beliefs and rituals have changed so much over time, while Zoroastrian today is considered monotheistic, there were times in history, as we'll go through, where it might have been characterized as polytheistic.
Yeah, so Trevor, you want to tell us why we can blame like one European guy for the fact that Zoroastrianism is mostly viewed as monotheistic? Angra Mainyu is sort of
Was it Constantine?
Why Angra Mainyu is sort of equated explicitly as like, the devil, the way the Christians view it. And, why these sort of concepts, even as we explain them, like why we explain them that way and why they're viewed that way, even kind of within Zoroastrianism itself now.
Yeah, unfortunately, no, it's not Constantine. This guy does not have nearly such a cool name.
No.
Reverend John Wilson, a Scottish missionary.
The Great.
Was a Scottish missionary and the head of the Bombay Royal Asiatic Society during the 1830s and 40s. Before I completely throw him under the bus, he did do some good things like making education more available to local Indian children and opening a Hebrew school for the local Jewish minority.
All right, 2 actions don't make you a saint.
Yeah. His problem as a missionary was that while by the Christian definition of the term, Hindus were obviously pagans, there were a few 100 million more of them than there were of him. But there were only a few tens of thousands of Zoroastrians as a tiny minority in the region that he could pick on and harass. So he would go to Zoroastrian lay people in particular, along with other missionaries from his school, who couldn't cite their sources or invoke specific passages from scripture. He was demanding that they provide an equivalent to chapter and verse in the Bible, and they were relying on oral traditions, what they were taught in temple, and what they could read in the Shahnameh. Because even today, most people can't actually read the Avestan language used in their actual scriptures. So John Wilson and company harassed and persecuted the Zoroastrian minority called Parsis as pagans. The extraordinarily neutral-toned Encyclopedia Iranica describes this as an insidious attack. They are literally more generous with warlords. So the community in the Parsi community in India tried to adapt to this. They started using more Christian-esque iconography, especially when depicting the prophet Zarathustra. Specifically, they started making him look a lot like Jesus. If you look up modern depictions of Zarathustra, down to the color palette and the style of robe and the beard, he will look quite a lot like Jesus with some different jewelry and decorations.
That's insane. I actually never noticed that.
Mm-hmm. It's a cooler beard, though.
Yeah, it's a much bushier beard on average.
And also much more luscious hair. What conditioner is in that?
But about a decade later, another European guy arrived, named Martin Haug. Instead of being a jerk to the locals, he talked to them, and he actually was there to learn Avestan. And he helped make the first widely available translations into other languages. Specifically, he worked on a German version, and then that was used to help create the first Gujarati translations, which made it finally something that many members of the community could actually read. But in his academic writing, Martin Haug reinterpreted Zoroastrianism as a strictly monotheistic religion with angels and archangels. He modeled his perception of it very much on Christianity, whereas especially during the Middle Ages, Zoroastrianism had shifted to putting a lot more emphasis on the Yazatas, the lesser spirits worthy of worship, kind of reverting them back to the same early form of minor deity that they had been in ancient history. Haug and some of his Parsi friends became early proponents of Gatha-only Zoroastrianism. So taking the oldest section of Zoroastrian scripture and deciding that that was the only legitimate example. But over the following decades and into the 20th century, Zoroastrian community leaders took this and spun it in a variety of different ways. The most common strain became something promoted by Dastur Meherji Rana, which was kind of a middle road between the all-out polytheism option and Haug's strict monotheism. But a lot of Parsis, especially those with the most direct contact with Christian missionaries, adopted Haug's line of thinking as a adaptation to dealing with the British. So that became one aspect of Zoroastrianism. Another reformist movement interpreted Zarathustra as a monotheist who eschewed all other rituals, adopting an almost agnostic approach to their own religion. And all of these different strains are now part of the Zoroastrian community today.
Christians aren't the only ones with a bunch of various little sects, despite the small number of Zoroastrians.
Yeah. In a community of about 200,000 people, you can find like 5 extremely distinct ways of approaching their religion.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us right on time for questions. So, a question from John: how did the Hellenistic age impact Zoroastrianism?
Well, I am in the thick of that right now. It is an interesting thing. It definitely shifted the setting of Zoroastrian worship. That this is the period where you really start to see temples being built around the sacred fires instead of open air shrines. It influenced also a lot of the iconography. You get much more Greek looking depictions of deity and Yazatas, the lesser spirits, in post-Hellenistic art. But I think the biggest one is something that actually mostly faded in history, is a school of Zoroastrianism from late antiquity called Zurvanism that was heavily influenced by the Orphic mysteries in ancient Greece.
Do love a good Zurvanism, I'm sorry.
Are there any other questions for our panelists? Please put them in the chat now.
Yeah, I've got a little bit of an observation while those are going in, but I found myself thinking, as Trevor was describing, was it Wilson and Haug, like the different approaches, just these sort of colonial impacts from these missionaries and their styles, like, you know, not only the way that they approach, you know, the culture, and, you know, either ignore it and just try to erase it, or, you know, just kind of try and listen and learn. The way that those have different responses have played out in history. Like I think about like the Dominicans, and to a lesser extent, but still present extent, the Franciscans were kind of known for stomping around, just completely like culturally insensitive in China, versus the Jesuits were more known for, you know, actually trying to learn Chinese culture, literally the Chinese language and like the classics, and they were much more effective as missionaries for that, which, you know, with a smaller community where, you know, if you convert away, you know, all of the followers of this traditional religion, obviously that didn't happen in China, but, you know, it's funny because the ones that are least effective as missionaries, you know, cultural historians could be glad for that, because then the culture's still there to study, you know, even though it may have some influences, whereas the ones that are more effective as missionaries, then that's kind of a loss for history in a lot of cultural history in a lot of cases. So just interesting ways these religious orders. I like to play a game with myself and guessing which religious order a Catholic missionary I know will belong to based off of the way that they go about it. I'm like, oh, yep, okay, yep, that checks out. There's not, obviously it's not always the case, but there's patterns.
So what does that say about the Jesuits, Greg?
Generally good things.
Well, I think there also might be a point there, though, that at least with our example of Zoroastrianism, the guy that like took the time to learn the language and talk to everyone was also almost more successful in changing the sort of religious doctrine to be more strictly monotheistic. Was the guy who took the time to learn the language and to like ingratiate himself with the community, was more effective in making Zoroastrianism into something that was more European friendly.
Yeah.
Because like he ingratiated himself first, and therefore like his influence on the faith was more effective in making it again more, we're gonna call it so more syncretic in a way with the European expectations of what a faith should be.
And I think
Also,
that's something that
ahead.
Constantine did pretty well as well, because like even like his wars, him turning them into a religious war, and then him putting the symbol of the whatever he saw in the sky on the shields of his soldiers, right? Like that's joining everyone for a cause.
Causes are unifying, as we know.
I'm gonna start calling him Constantine the Accursed, like he's Alexander, and I'm like at a Persian source, you know. I start
I
calling
will.
him Constantine the Accursed.
Yeah, definitely
That's even
Christianity's
cooler.
perception of military action in general and serving in the military was something that was also impacted by the
Oh,
presence of
yeah.
Constantine. Right from, that initial, hey, we're putting the Christian symbols on our shields. Like that's a little on the nose for this, don't you think?
But a lot of
Again,
soldiers at that time had been converting to, because it was one
Mhm.
of the only, it was like one of the few religions that had like, ooh, after I die, it's not nothing. And soldiers, like, if they're fighting and they could die at any moment, they like to have that thought where I can go somewhere else, you know.
well, there's
Not
also
not just where there isn't war.
Salvation is really appealing if your job is to swing swords at people all day.
I believe it's no
well,
atheist in a foxhole.
yeah, and also I think early on, I mean, the quote is early on that early Christianity was the religion of like women and slaves.
Yeah.
Because it was the only religion that offered them an idea that at least in the future, everyone was equal.
Yeah.
That in the
Communism.
afterlife, yeah, that like this sort of spiritual communism, that like in the future that they would be equal, whereas a lot of the sort of classical Greco-Roman faith was everyone was in a hierarchy on purpose, right? Like you were where you were for a reason. Where Christianity, early Christianity, offered a more equalizing foothold. So, like women and slaves and soldiers, people of lower classes or lower standing were more likely to join at first.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing Constantine did by making it a state religion was then taking that Christianity and taking it sort of from them, from a religion of the underclass to a religion of the ruling class, which I think had a lot of powerful implications going forward.
The broification of Christianity.
You could call it the hierarchification sort of Christianity, I would argue.
Yeah, in my brain, I always think like Theodosius had more of a like impact on
Mhm.
forcing Christianity into like the
Yeah.
rest
Oh,
of the
yeah.
world.
Sure.
But I
Yeah.
guess you could argue that it was only a matter of time before someone came along after Constantine and did that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right? Like Theodosius wasn't an outlier. There was, if it wasn't him, it would have been someone else. But where Constantine,
Theodosius-
it was him, and he is the reason. No one else had to do that.
Yeah, Theodosius is the logical consequence of the Council of Nicaea.
Yeah.
Once you decide
Yes.
that the state is going to be involved in suppressing heresy, eventually the state is going to try and suppress all of the heresy.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think it's an interesting counterpoint where Zoroastrian went from not having any state power to having quite a bit for a really long time, particularly through like the Sasanian period.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly and abruptly having no state power anymore ever again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that is the traditional story of Zarathustra, is his journey to finding someone to give the faith state power in the character of Mistashpa. But then you go a few thousand years and the Arabs roll through, and all of a sudden you're refugees in Mumbai.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So John has asked, was there ever a Zoroastrian equivalent to excommunication?
I actually have no idea.
I think your soul just went to hell.
Yeah, there wasn't. It was usually execution.
Yep.
Simpler,
Well,
simpler.
let's take care of the body. The soul will do its own thing.
Never at the on the ground personal level of like peasants or whole armies being excommunicated by the Pope that we see in the Middle Ages, but
Well,
condemnation and legal prohibitions being put on especially Sassanid area heretics was fairly common. You get that with
The
religious
Mazdakites.
leaders like Mazdak and Mani, and at different times, different schools of thought seem to go out of vogue, and whole lineages of priestly thought suddenly drop out of the historical record. So clearly there's some kind of suppression going on, but it wasn't quite as formalized.
Great. We are in our last 5 minutes here. So if there's any final questions, get them in now. And I'll turn it over to you, panelists, if you have any final thoughts, any lines you want to draw under this.
I think if Jeff was there during the Council of Nicaea, which he was, but the history books won't tell you that much.
He would just get punched by St. Nicholas.
Yeah, he was actually on Arius's side, so
he was an Arian. I think he was an Arian, and that's why we don't know, because he lost.
Ended up in the cell next to St. Nick or something.
He just kept asking about
I
the
remember
date of Easter.
He specifically went to the Council of Nicaea after the Pope told him, hey, like, I can't make it. I'm just not doing well right now. I need you to tell them that I'm not on Arius's side. And all Jeff heard was Arius's side, and then went and caused a big split where one council made another place down the road. Bloody Jeff.
Classic papal legacy.
I mean, I feel like Jeff would have had a stance on the whole issue of self-castration, which was also a big thing in Nicaea. So
yeah,
it depends on whether it's accidental. Sometimes things just happen.
4 episodes away from our first
castration.
We're like 4 episodes away from our first only castrated Jeff.
Well,
oh boy.
I want to.
Nope.
I want to say that I know we have a question, but I want to say my line I want to draw under this is I think we should go back to having more subcults and subversions of thought in every religious tradition. I think Christianity should subdivide further. I think we should go back to, instead of having a single authority, we need more individual weird little guys.
There's a
lot of weird little guys.
I know you're looking at the
Okay.
Palmyrene Church.
There's a podcast called From Wittenberg to Westphalia.
Yeah, I heard they just got
one.
to they just got to the invention of the written word. We might actually get to cults eventually.
All right, we got 4 minutes, so let's go to these final questions. Elio said, is any other points like otters were sacred because they represented the souls of 1,000 dogs? Such an interesting religion. Where's our weird?
Well, Zoroastrianism had some really very specific rules about that, like, killing an otter was like a capital offense because otters were like dogs and killing dogs was a capital offense. Cats, not. Dogs, yes.
I just want a sports team that's got the water dogs as their mascot. Although I also think a sports team with the Cardinals as their mascot, but just have it be an elderly Italian gentleman would also be fantastic. So I don't necessarily have good ideas.
On Elio's question, a huge chunk of the religious text called the Vendidad is just kind of odd little religious laws like that. It's most of the text is along those lines.
I call the Vendidad like it's sort of like Zoroastrian Deuteronomy. Where you're like, here's a whole bunch of weird little laws that you're supposed to follow that we've kind of ignored now.
The brosification of Zoroastrianism, really.
So last question from John. Trevor talked about Xerxes' Deva inscription early in his show. Is the inscription some indication that there were sects in Persia that the state considered heretical?
To be really quick about it, maybe. The Deva inscription is a really complicated question that we will probably never have actual answers to. In my reading of it, I think it does refer to either that or something happening in the border region with India, and it's referring to something involving Vedic or early Hinduism. But it's either that or some sort of heresy.
And I want to add to that in like the early sort of Achaemenid period, it'll be a lot harder to like nail down what is and isn't a Zoroastrian heresy by the state. The Sasanian period, it's a lot easier because there definitely were heresies, what the state considered heresies in the Sasanian period.
Yeah, again,
when it became a much more formalized institution.
It struggles with that. Like, at what point did it kind of make that shift from polytheistic to monotheistic, right? And
the good thing with Xerxes' inscription is that using the word Deva literally means gods who are bad. So you can definitely say like they didn't like that one. We just don't know what that one was.
Awesome.
We
Well,
know
this is the
this
perfect
much.
this is the perfect moment to wrap up right on time. So thank you so much to our panelists for being here. And thank you for our attendees for watching. If you'd like to consider or continue the conversation, the lobby chat is open and everyone else will be headed, I'm sure, to the last keynote of the day. So we'll see you there and we'll see you at the after party. Thanks for being here. See you later.
See you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Wow.